You can tear down any wall you want if Megan gives you permission. It's her house. The words came out quieter than I expected, which made them hit harder. Andrew froze with his wine glass halfway to his mouth. Lisa stared at me. Megan closed her eyes for 1 second and set down her fork. 5 minutes earlier, my son had been explaining how he planned to open the wall between my dining room and living room when the time came, while my daughter argued that selling the place would be smarter. They had been dividing my home while I was still sitting at the head of the table. Andrew finally said, "What do you mean? Her house?" I looked at all three of them. Exactly what I said. If family has ever mistaken your kindness for a promise, stay with me. To understand how we got there, I have to go back 3 years. My name is Robert Mercer. I'm 72. And before I retired, I built houses around Raleigh, North Carolina. I started as a framing carpenter at 19 and eventually ran a small contracting company for 35 years. I spent most of that time believing that if I worked hard enough, my family would never have to worry the way I had growing up. My wife, Carol, used to tell me I confused providing with protecting. I thought she meant I worked too much. After she died of cancer 3 years before that dinner, I began to understand she meant something else. We had 3 children. Andrew, 48, who owned 2 restaurants. Lisa, 45, an office manager rebuilding her finances after a divorce. And Megan, 39, a school counselor who had quietly carried much of the load during Carol's illness. None of them began as villains, but habits become expectations, and expectations can harden into entitlement when nobody draws a line. The house sat on a half-acre outside Raleigh. I had built it 29 years earlier, and Carol had chosen nearly everything inside it, from the brick to the kitchen tile. An appraisal 18 months before the dinner put its value around $720,000. Andrew and Lisa apparently saw that number more clearly than they saw the fact that I still lived there. What they did not know was that the deed no longer carried my name alone. 18 months earlier, I had transferred the property to Megan through a normal sale with an independent appraisal, separate legal representation, title work, a mortgage lender, and a recorded arrangement preserving my right to live there for the rest of my life. Megan held the ownership interest, subject to my lifetime right to remain. She had sold her condo, used her savings, and borrowed the rest. It was not a gift, and it was not something she had slipped in front of me while I was grieving. Keeping the sale quiet was my mistake. Megan had urged me to tell Andrew and Lisa, but I could already hear the accusations. She had even asked whether I wanted a formal cognitive evaluation documented before closing, because she feared they might someday claim she had pressured me. I laughed at that. They may get mad, I told her, but they know me better than that. Megan looked at me and said, "Dad, people know what they need to know when money gets involved." I ignored the warning because silence felt easier than conflict. That was a pattern in our family. When Andrew's business struggled, I helped. When Lisa's divorce left her in trouble, I helped. When anyone needed money, I wrote a check or found a solution. Then told myself love meant not keeping score. I did not realize that every rescue was also teaching my children something about what they could expect from me. The dinner itself began normally. I made pot roast. Megan brought green beans. Lisa brought wine. Andrew arrived late with expensive bread and immediately told me the roof needed replacing. We talked about Lisa's daughter looking at graduate schools, staffing problems at Andrew's newer restaurant, and a student Megan had helped. Then Lisa noticed a remodeling flyer on the counter. "Are you finally doing the kitchen?" she asked. I said I was only pricing cabinet doors. Andrew looked at the flyer and said, "Don't put too much into it. At your age, you're not getting the money back." The phrase, "at your age," stayed with me. I asked what money he thought I needed to get back. He shrugged. "Eventually we'll have to decide whether to keep the place or sell it." Lisa immediately said selling made more sense because of property taxes. Megan went silent. I should have stopped them. Instead, I listened. Andrew said he wanted the house kept in the family. Lisa asked how he planned to buy out her share. He answered that his share should be larger because he had worked for my company years earlier. Lisa reminded him he had been paid. Andrew called it sweat equity. Then Lisa argued that she had helped Carol after surgeries. Andrew said Megan had done most of that. And Megan finally said, "Can we not do this at dinner?" He waved her off. "You don't understand the numbers. This is a major asset." Major asset. Not Dad's home. Not Mom's kitchen. Not the place where their heights were still penciled inside the pantry door. Then Andrew looked toward the living room and said, "First thing I'd do is take out that wall. Open the whole space up." I asked, "First thing after what?" He hesitated. "You know, someday." That was when I put down my fork and told him whose permission he would actually need. Andrew recovered first. "That's not funny." I told him I was not joking. Lisa turned to Megan and asked, "What did he sign?" "Not, Dad. Is this what you wanted?" Her first question was what I had signed. Megan's face tightened. He didn't just sign something I handed him. I explained that there had been a standard real estate closing 18 months earlier. Independent appraisal. Independent attorney. Recorded deed. Megan paid for the property. And I kept the legal right to live there for life. Lisa demanded to know the price. I told her it was private. That made things worse. "Private?" she said. "It's the family house," I answered. It was my house. Andrew repeated the word "was" as if I had insulted him. I said, "Yes. Was. Now it's Megan's." He stopped looking angry and started looking calculating, which disturbed me far more. Andrew began questioning Megan like an attorney. "Were you there when Dad met with his lawyer?" "No." "When he signed?" "No." "Did you choose the appraiser?" "No." Each answer took away the story he wanted. Lisa started crying quietly. "Mom would never have wanted this," she said. That hurt because she knew it would. I replied, "Your mother wanted me to make my own decisions while I was alive." Lisa said Carol believed in treating the children equally. I asked when Carol had told her that. She looked down. Andrew stepped in. "Nobody's saying you can't make decisions. Dad, we're saying Megan may have taken advantage of a bad period. You had just lost Mom. You were grieving. She was here all the time." Megan flinched. I told him to choose his next words carefully. He lifted his hands. "I'm being realistic. That kind of situation matters." I asked, "Matters to what?" Andrew looked straight at me. "To whether a transfer like this holds up." The sentence had legal shape to it. I asked, "Holds up where?" He took a drink of water. "I've read enough to know deeds can be challenged." I let a few seconds pass. "Why were you reading about challenging deeds when you supposedly learned about the sale 30 seconds ago? For the first time that evening?" Andrew had no quick answer. He looked at Lisa. Lisa looked away. That exchange told me more than either of them intended. The argument ended soon after. At the front door, Andrew turned back and said, "Dad, don't do anything else until we talk." I asked what he meant. "Your accounts. Your finance. Papers. Just wait." I told him good night. Lisa hugged me before leaving. But it felt automatic. Like the sort of hug people give at funerals when they do not know what else to do. Megan stayed behind to clear the table. After a few minutes, she sat across from me and said, "There's something I should have told you." 2 weeks earlier, Andrew had called her and asked when the house was transferred, which attorney handled it, and whether I had been taking any medication around that time. She refused to answer. He claimed he was only trying to understand my planning. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. She looked ashamed. "Because I knew you'd call him immediately. And I thought maybe he'd let it go." I almost smiled at the irony. Every Mercer was trying to avoid a confrontation, just in different directions. Then Megan added that Lisa had asked her something odd the previous month. Whether my doctor had ever mentioned memory problems. The moment she said it, I remembered a coffee on the porch and a conversation I had dismissed as ordinary concern. Lisa had asked whether I ever forgot appointments, and whether my doctor had given me one of those memory tests. I had joked that forgetting appointments at 72 was practically a hobby, At the time, I assumed she was worried because her former father-in-law had dementia. Now the question sounded different. I told Megan I wanted to review every document from the sale in the morning. She said she would bring copies. I reminded her that my own closing folder was in the study. She nodded. Good. Just make sure you have everything together. Even then, she was careful not to tell me what decision to make. After she left, I locked the front door and walked through the quiet house. Carol's framed photograph sat on the piano. I looked at it and said, "You saw this coming, didn't you?" Carol never had trouble telling me when I was being foolish while she was alive. That night, I could almost hear her answer. I went into the study for the closing folder. On the desk sat the old laser printer Lisa had used that afternoon because hers was out of ink. I moved a stack of mail and noticed 3 pages still in the output tray. At first, I assumed they were forms from her dental office. The first page contained legal language and a heading about seeking court-appointed guardianship over an adult alleged to be unable to manage his own affairs. I read the first paragraph twice. The next page was a checklist. Medical records. Examples of impaired judgment. Financial decisions. Witness statements. My hands became strangely steady. Then I turned to the third page. It was not a filed court document. It appeared to be notes copied into a draft template. Near the top was a line marked Respondent. Beside it, typed neatly, were 2 words. Robert Mercer. I sat down without meaning to. The chair simply caught me. At 72, you expect your children to worry about you. You expect questions about driving at night, doctors, ladders, blood pressure, and whether you should still climb onto the roof to clean gutters. What you do not expect is to find your own name on paperwork designed to prove you cannot manage your life. I replayed the evening, Andrew speaking about challenging a deed before he should have known there was one. Lisa asking about memory tests. Both of them telling me to stop making financial decisions until we had talked. The pages did not prove every suspicion forming in my head. I was too old to mistake fear for evidence. Maybe they believed they were protecting me. Maybe they believed they were protecting what they thought would someday belong to them. Either way, they had been discussing my competence without me, and that crossed a line I had never imagined needing to draw with my own children. I slid the 3 pages into my closing folder and locked the desk drawer. My first instinct was to call Andrew and demand an explanation. 10 years earlier, I would have done exactly that. I would have raised my voice. He would have raised his. Lisa would have cried. Megan would have tried to make peace. And by morning I probably would have offered some compromise just to stop the family from breaking apart. That realization embarrassed me because it showed how predictable I had become. Carol had accused me more than once of paying for peace instead of solving problems. For once, I decided not to react on instinct. I wrote down what had happened at dinner while the details were fresh. I noted Andrew's exact words about challenging the deed and Lisa's earlier questions about my memory. Then I placed the note with the printed pages. In the morning, I would not call either of my children. I would call David Klein, the lawyer who had represented me when I sold the house. David Klein's office was on the 3rd floor of a brick building near downtown Raleigh, and I was sitting across from him before 10 the next morning, with the 3 pages from my printer sealed inside a manila envelope. David was 61, soft-spoken, and irritatingly patient in the way good lawyers often are. He read the pages without interrupting me, then asked me to repeat exactly what Andrew had said at dinner. When I finished, he leaned back and folded his hands. "These pages are not proof that anyone filed anything," he said. "They could be research. They could be preparation. But combined with the questions about your memory and the deed, I would take them seriously." I asked whether Megan's ownership could actually be overturned. David did not reassure me with false certainty. Anyone can file a lawsuit. "Robert, winning one is different. Fortunately, we documented that sale very carefully." He pulled my closing file from a cabinet and spread it across the conference table. There was the independent appraisal valuing the property at $720,000. There was the purchase agreement, the title report, Megan's financing documents, the wire confirmation from the closing company, and the recorded deed. Most important to David was the file memo he had written after our first meeting. It stated that I had come to him without Megan present, that I understood the transfer would remove the house from my future estate, and that I wanted a legally protected right to live there for the remainder of my life. You remember why I made you explain the transaction back to me in your own words? David asked. I did. At the time, I had called it excessive. Now it felt like a rope tied around my waist before I knew I might fall. The arrangement had never been as simple as Andrew and Lisa would later describe it. Megan had not received a $720,000 house for nothing. The appraisal established market value, but the sale reflected the existing secured debt, my retained lifetime right of occupancy, and the financing structure her lender approved. The exact numbers were documented, not invented over dinner, and every dollar that changed hands had a paper trail. If someone argues undue influence, David said, they'll need facts showing she overpowered your free will, not merely that she helped care for you. I asked, what would happen if they argued I lacked capacity? He tapped the closing memo. Then they'll have to confront the fact that you negotiated terms, reviewed an appraisal, met independently with me, understood the tax and estate consequences, and insisted on your right to remain in the home. That is not what an accidental transfer looks like. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt insulted in a way I could not name. I had built houses through recessions, survived payroll shortages, negotiated commercial loans, cared for my wife through cancer, and buried her without forgetting who I was. Yet 2 of my children were apparently collecting examples of me misplacing appointments. David must have seen something in my face because he said, do not call them today. I told him I had already decided that, good, anger makes terrible evidence. He advised me to write down relevant events, preserve messages, and avoid moving money around merely because I was frightened. If Andrew or Lisa genuinely believed I was impaired, dramatic financial changes could be twisted into support for their claim. For the first time in my life, protecting myself from my children required the same discipline I had once used negotiating with people I did not trust. Andrew called before I reached home. I let it ring. Lisa called 20 minutes later. I let that one ring too. By noon, I had 4 text messages. Andrew's first said, we need to discuss this before Megan makes things worse. The second said, please don't make any financial changes until we understand what happened. Lisa's message was softer. Dad, I love you. Nobody is trying to take anything from you. That sentence bothered me because I had never accused her of doing so. I spent the afternoon gathering bank statements, property records, old loan files, and tax folders from the cabinets Carol had organized better than I ever did. Every few minutes, I found her handwriting on a label or yellow sticky note. Seeing it hurt. But it also reminded me that Carol had always insisted on keeping records. Memory changes, she used to say. Paper doesn't care what anyone remembers. They arrived together the following evening without asking. I almost did not let them in. But David had told me not to behave as though I was hiding. Andrew came through the door carrying concern like a suit he had recently purchased. Lisa looked exhausted. We sat in the living room, the same wall Andrew had proposed tearing down, separating us from the dining room. He began by saying, we're worried about you. I answered, you seemed more worried about the deed. Lisa said that was unfair. She explained that the guardianship pages were only research because Andrew had suggested they learn what families should do if an aging parent became vulnerable. And my name happened to be typed into the form? I asked. She looked at Andrew. He answered for her. We were trying to understand the process. Nobody filed anything. I believed the last sentence. I did not believe that explained the first. I asked Andrew directly whether he planned to challenge Megan's ownership. He crossed one leg over the other and said, I think the transaction should be reviewed. That wasn't my question. He sighed. If you were pressured. Yes. I think we need options. I asked who we meant. He said the family. I almost laughed. The family includes Megan. Lisa interrupted before the argument could harden. Dad, you weren't yourself after Mom died. You barely slept. You lost weight. Megan was here constantly. Then suddenly the house is hers and nobody knows. I reminded Lisa that grief was not incompetence. She said, I didn't say it was. Andrew added. But it matters. The phrase was exactly the kind of language David had warned me about. Reasonable enough to sound compassionate. Vague enough to carry an accusation. I asked them whether they thought I could manage my own finances. Neither answered immediately. That silence told me where we stood. I asked Lisa whether she remembered borrowing $40,000 after her divorce because her ex-husband stopped covering several expenses they had expected him to pay. Her expression changed. What does that have to do with this? I said nothing more, because I had not yet reviewed enough records to trust my memory. Andrew leaned forward. This is what I'm talking about. You're jumping between things. The cheapness of that tactic surprised me. I had introduced a financial example in a conversation about family assets, and he tried to turn it into evidence of confusion. For the first time, I understood how easily ordinary behavior could be reframed once people decided on a conclusion. I stood and told them the conversation was over. Lisa asked me not to shut them out, then stopped discussing my competence behind my back. I said, Andrew replied, if you're fine, you shouldn't be afraid of anyone checking. After they left, I wrote that sentence down. Then I began opening the financial files. At first, I was searching for proof that I still understood my own affairs. Instead, I found a history of how I had used the house as an emergency fund for my children. 12 years earlier, Andrew's first restaurant had nearly failed after a contractor dispute and several months of lower-than-expected revenue. He needed $65,000 quickly. A bank would not give him favorable terms. So I had opened a home equity line and covered the gap. Andrew eventually repaid $16,000 before business problems resumed, and I told him to stop worrying about the rest. I had forgotten how large the original amount was. In my mind, the event had become that time I helped Andrew with the restaurant. On paper, it was a much larger sacrifice. Lisa's history appeared in a different folder, 7 years earlier, during her divorce. She was desperate to keep her children in the same school district. Her lawyer fees were climbing. Her ex-husband was fighting over support, and she was behind on several bills. Carol and I had given her $25,000 outright, then later covered another $32,000 through funds drawn against the house. There were smaller amounts too. Tuition assistance, a medical bill, a credit card balance she had hidden out of embarrassment. None of them had seemed unreasonable individually. Together they formed a pattern. I kept a legal pad beside me and added the numbers. After 2 hours, I stopped because I did not trust myself to continue without checking every entry. The total already exceeded what I would once have believed. Carol's voice came back to me. Robert, you never keep score, so they never see what the game costs. Megan's name appeared far less often. I found a $5,000 loan for a used car when she was 26, repaid within 14 months. A few years later, we had helped her with closing costs on her condo, and she had insisted on paying back half, even though Carol told her not to. There were birthday checks, holiday gifts, and normal parental help, but nothing resembling the rescues Andrew and Lisa had received. That did not make Megan better. It meant she had made different choices and had different problems. What bothered me was that I had always treated those differences as temporary. Andrew needed more because his business was risky. Lisa needed more because divorce was expensive. Megan needed less, so I gave her less. I had called that fairness. Now Andrew and Lisa were approaching the remaining property as though all 3 children were starting from the same line. The next week, the consequences spread beyond the 4 of us. My sister, Ellen, called from Virginia and asked whether I was doing all right mentally. I knew immediately that Lisa had spoken to her. When I asked what she had heard, Ellen hesitated, then admitted Lisa had said Megan persuaded me to sign over the house during a vulnerable period. She sounded scared. Ellen said, She thinks you might be making decisions you wouldn't normally make. I told her I had sold the property 18 months earlier with my own lawyer and an independent appraisal. Ellen was quiet. That isn't how Lisa described it. I felt something cold settle in my chest. A private disagreement had become a story about my decline. I told Ellen I appreciated her concern, but asked her not to participate in conversations about my mental capacity unless she was willing to speak directly to me first. 2 days later, my cousin Mark called with almost the same questions. That was when I stopped treating the situation as emotional fallout from dinner. Someone was establishing a narrative. David agreed. He suggested I schedule a routine appointment with my primary care physician. Not because a medical exam would decide a property dispute, but because I should continue managing my health normally and have accurate records rather than reacting later to selective claims. I disliked the idea at first because it felt like proving I deserved adulthood. Still, I went. Dr. Patel had treated me for 11 years. We discussed sleep, blood pressure, grief, medications, and memory. He saw no clinical reason to believe I could not manage my affairs. I refused to ask him to write some dramatic declaration. I simply wanted the medical record to reflect reality, not whichever version of me my children found useful. Meanwhile, I continued reconstructing the history of the house. When Megan bought it, there was still substantial secured debt against the property. The largest portion came from refinancing and the home equity borrowing Carol and I had used over the years. Some of that money had gone toward legitimate house improvements and medical costs during Carol's treatment, but a painful share had gone toward Andrew and Lisa. I called Samuel Reed, the accountant who had handled my business and personal returns for more than 20 years. He agreed to help me sort the transfers into categories. "You trying to collect from the kids?" he asked. "No," I said. "I'm trying to remember accurately." That distinction mattered to me. I did not want to turn every act of generosity into a retroactive debt merely because I was angry. A gift was still a gift. But gifts did not magically disappear from history just because the recipients preferred not to remember them. Samuel and I spent most of Friday morning reviewing statements. When we finished the first pass, Andrew's direct support and business assistance approached $130,000, depending on which transactions we counted. Lisa's was a little under $90,000. Samuel warned me not to use rough totals publicly until every entry was verified. I agreed. The numbers themselves were less important than what they revealed. The equity Andrew and Lisa were fighting over had already been reduced. In part, to help them live their lives, I drove home thinking about how Carol had opposed the second refinance. At the time, I called her overly cautious. She had said, "We're turning our house into everybody else's emergency account." I told her family was more important than equity. She answered, "Then make sure they understand the difference between receiving help and owning the source of it." That evening, Megan came over with groceries. I told her about Ellen and Mark. She looked sick. I never wanted any of this. I said I knew. She asked whether she should transfer the house back to me temporarily to stop the accusations. My answer came faster than I expected. "No." She stared at me. I explained that reversing a legitimate sale simply because Andrew and Lisa were applying pressure would make the situation worse and teach exactly the wrong lesson. Megan said she could live without the house. "This isn't about whether you can live without it," I told her. "You paid for it. You sold your condo. You took out a mortgage. You planned your future around the deal. I'm not making you surrender something you bought because your brother and sister are angry they didn't inherit it before I died." Saying those words aloud made the absurdity of the entire conflict impossible to ignore. The following Monday, David called shortly after lunch. His voice was different from usual, more formal. "Robert, I received correspondence this morning from an attorney representing Andrew and Lisa." I sat down at the kitchen table. The letter did not yet initiate a lawsuit, but it was no longer family conversation. Their attorney claimed there were concerns about my capacity at the time of the transfer and possible undue influence by Megan because of her caregiving role after Carol's death. The letter requested that no further transactions involving the property take place and suggested the deed might be subject to challenge. David read several passages to me, then said he would forward a copy. I asked the only question that mattered. Both their names are on it? There was a pause. Yes. They are both identified as clients. For some foolish reason, I had still hoped Lisa was merely frightened and following Andrew's lead without fully committing herself. When the letter arrived by email, I printed it and read every line. Andrew and Lisa described themselves as concerned children seeking to protect their father from exploitation. Megan was portrayed not as their sister who had spent years helping their mother through chemotherapy, but as a person who had occupied a position of trust and influence. The language was careful. Nothing openly accused her of theft. That almost made it worse. It turned years of ordinary care into something suspicious. I thought of Megan sleeping on our couch after Carol's surgeries, driving us to appointments when I was too tired, and sitting in the hospital cafeteria pretending not to cry. Andrew had visited. Lisa had helped. But Megan had reorganized her entire schedule around us. Now that devotion was being repackaged as evidence that she had been close enough to manipulate me. I wanted to tear the letter in half. Instead, I placed it beside the pages from my printer. That was when I finally understood the scale of my own mistake. I had believed silence would preserve the family. By hiding the sale, I had given Andrew and Lisa room to build whatever explanation made sense to them. By rescuing them financially for years without boundaries, I had taught them that my resources were permanently available. By refusing difficult conversations, I had left my children to confuse generosity with entitlement and expectation with ownership. Their choices were still theirs, but I could no longer pretend I had played no role in creating the conditions around them. David asked what I wanted to do next. I looked at Carol's handwriting on one of the folders and said, "First, we stop reacting. Then we find out exactly how far back this really goes." The next morning, Samuel sent me a message saying he had found several older loan records I had forgotten existed, including one refinancing document tied directly to Andrew's restaurant rescue and another connected to Lisa's post-divorce expenses. He wrote, "Robert, you need to see the full timeline before making any decisions." I read the message twice. The dispute was no longer only about a deed signed 18 months earlier. The house had been financing pieces of my children's lives for more than a decade, and neither Andrew nor Lisa seemed interested in remembering that history while fighting over what they believed remained. I called Samuel and told him to assemble everything. As I hung up, I realized I was finally doing something I should have done years before. I was keeping score not to punish anyone, but because without the score, nobody could understand what the game had actually cost. Samuel Reed arrived at my house on Wednesday morning carrying 2 banker's boxes and a laptop. We worked at the dining table where Andrew and Lisa had argued over the house less than 2 weeks earlier. Samuel had organized the records by year, account, and purpose. "I'm not here to tell you what these numbers mean emotionally," he said. "I'm only going to tell you where the money went." That was exactly what I needed. We started with Andrew. There were business loans I had guaranteed, direct transfers when payroll came up short, a tax bill I covered, and the home equity withdrawal tied to his first restaurant crisis. Some money came back. Most did not. Samuel's verified total for direct support and unrepaid assistance was $132,000. I stared at the number and said, "That can't be right." Samuel turned the laptop toward me. "Then show me which transaction doesn't belong." I could not. Every payment had a story attached to it. $28,000 after a refrigeration failure nearly closed Andrew's restaurant. $15,000 to cover payroll during a bad winter. A larger amount from the original home equity line when his first expansion went over budget. I remembered each emergency clearly once I saw the dates. At the time, every decision had felt temporary. "He'll repay us when business improves," I would tell Carol. Sometimes Andrew tried. Sometimes I told him to stop because he was struggling. Eventually I stopped calling them money loans because calling them gifts made everyone more comfortable. Samuel moved to Lisa's file. Her total was $87,000. including the divorce assistance, attorney expenses, overdue bills, and several payments we made so her children could stay in their school district. Again, none of it looked outrageous alone. Together, it was almost $250,000 between the two of them. The house had financed a meaningful portion of that generosity. Samuel separated the sources. Some help came from savings and business income. Some came from refinancing. Some came from the home equity line. After Carol's medical expenses and our own renovations were removed, a significant amount of the secured debt remaining before Megan's purchase could still be traced back to money used for Andrew and Lisa. That was the part that changed everything for me. They were accusing Megan of taking the family's largest asset while ignoring the fact that part of that asset's value had already been converted into cash for their benefit years earlier. I said, "They've already received pieces of the house." Samuel shook his head. "Be careful with that phrase. Legally, they received money from you. Emotionally, I understand what you mean. But don't turn gifts into retroactive debts just because they're angry now." I appreciated the correction. I did not want revenge disguised as accounting. We moved on to Megan. Her file was almost embarrassingly thin. A $5,000 car loan she repaid, help with closing costs on her condo, a few smaller gifts. All normal parental support. Samuel looked at me and said, "You weren't unfair on purpose." I answered, "That doesn't mean I wasn't unfair. I had always believed giving according to need was the right thing." Andrew was ambitious and took risks. Lisa had gone through a brutal divorce. Megan was stable, so she got less. I had told myself she did not need help. What I had really done was reward crisis. The child who kept her life in order received fewer resources because she created fewer emergencies. And now the two children who had needed the most were claiming they deserved an equal share of what remained. That realization hurt because it implicated me as much as it angered me. While Samuel packed up, he handed me a folder Carol had kept separately. "I almost didn't bring this," he said. "It isn't accounting." Inside were handwritten notes, household budgets, and pages from the small spiral notebooks Carol used during her treatment years. Most were ordinary: medication schedules, grocery lists, reminders to call insurance. Then I found a page dated about a year before she died. One sentence had been underlined twice. "Robert keeps fixing the consequences instead of asking the children to change the choices." Beneath it, she had written, "Every rescue becomes the new normal." I sat there for a long time. Samuel quietly closed his laptop. I remembered the argument that probably produced those words. Carol had objected when I wanted to refinance again. I called her cold. She had cried after I left the room. That memory led me to another conversation I had almost forgotten. Carol and I had been sitting on the back porch one summer evening after Andrew called about another business problem. She said, "You keep catching them every time they fall. Robert, one day, they're going to think the safety net belongs to them." I laughed and told her parents were supposed to help their children. "Help? Yes," she said. "But if they never feel the bottom, how do they learn where it is?" At the time, I thought she was being dramatic. Now Andrew and Lisa were trying to challenge Megan's ownership because they believed the house was part of a future inheritance that had been promised to them. I had never signed such a promise. But I had said things over the years like, "Someday this will all be yours." And I had backed those careless words with decades of financial rescue. I had helped build the expectation I was now fighting. David reviewed Samuel's work but warned me not to wave the numbers around like a weapon. "Your children receiving help does not prove they're wrong about your capacity," he said. "What it does prove is context. If this becomes litigation, we use facts carefully." He also told me something I needed to hear. Andrew and Lisa's attorney was likely building two related arguments. First, that I lacked sufficient capacity when I sold the house. Second, that Megan exercised undue influence because she was close to me during a vulnerable period. David believed the documentation around the sale made both arguments difficult, but not impossible to pursue. "Even a weak case can cost time and money," he said, "and family litigation has a way of producing damage no judge can repair." I asked what he recommended. A structured mediation before everyone digs in deeper. I agreed, though part of me wondered whether Andrew had already gone too far to come back. Megan hated the idea of mediation. They already decided what happened, she said. They don't want facts. I told her facts were not the only reason to go. I wanted Andrew and Lisa to say, in front of professionals, what they actually wanted. Megan paced around the kitchen. What if they forced me to spend $50,000 defending a house I bought legally? I could hear fear under her anger. That was the first moment I fully understood the burden my decision had placed on her. I had asked her to buy the house because it solved several problems at once. I needed liquidity. I wanted to stay there for life. And she wanted a stable home. I had treated the transaction as practical. Now she was spending money on a lawyer because her siblings refused to accept it. I said, if your legal costs come from this fight, I'll help. Megan immediately shook her head. No. That would give them another argument. She was right. And the fact that she was thinking more carefully than I was irritated me because it proved how much stress she was carrying. Then she said something worse. I can sell the house back to you. I asked her to repeat it. We unwind the whole thing. You get financing or we structure something with David. I take the loss. They stop. For a few seconds. I almost agreed. The old part of me saw peace sitting right there on the table. Give everyone something. Make the conflict disappear. Then I pictured Carol's notebook. Every rescue becomes the new normal. I told Megan, no. You paid for the house. You did nothing wrong. If you give it up because they pressure us, then I'm teaching them that enough pressure works. Megan looked at me for a long time. You really mean that? She asked. I'm trying to, I said. A few days later, Lisa called me alone. She sounded different without Andrew nearby. Dad, I need you to understand I'm not trying to take control of your life. I asked why she had researched guardianship using my name. She said Andrew told her they needed to understand every option if Megan had manipulated me. Every option includes taking away my right to manage my own money? She started crying. He said it would only be temporary if things got worse. That sentence chilled me. I asked who Andrew expected would control things during that temporary period. Lisa hesitated. He said we'd figure it out. I wrote that answer down after the call. Before hanging up, I asked her one more question. Did Andrew tell you the old will means you still own a third of the house? Silence. Then she said, he said Mom and you had already decided everything would be divided equally. That explained more than she intended. Years earlier, Carol and I had signed wills dividing our estate equally among the 3 children. At that time, the house was still in our estate. Andrew had apparently found or kept a copy of that old document and was treating it as though it preserved an ownership right that survived the later sale. I called David. He sighed when I told him, A will only controls property you own at death. He said, it does not resurrect property you sold years earlier. He asked how Andrew got the old will. I did not know. It might have been in Carol's papers after she died. It might have been a copy I once gave him. The important part was not possession. It was the story Andrew was telling Lisa, that the house had been promised equally, and Megan had somehow intercepted what belonged to them. That afternoon, I searched through old emails. I found several messages from 10 or 12 years earlier where I had casually written things like, one day the house will be yours to fight over. Usually joking. In another, after Andrew helped me repair a deck, I wrote, you kids can decide what to do with this place after your mother and I are gone. Reading those words made my stomach tighten. I had handed Andrew material he could use to make his resentment sound reasonable. Legally, those emails changed nothing. Emotionally, they mattered. I had created an expectation and then changed my plan without telling anyone. I still had every right to sell my property, but I could finally see why the change felt like betrayal to them. That realization did not excuse their actions. It did. However, strip away the comforting idea that I had been perfectly clear while everyone else behaved irrationally. David proposed mediation for the following month. Andrew and Lisa agreed through their attorney. Before we could get there, However, the dispute escalated. A formal petition was prepared challenging aspects of my ability to make financial decisions at the time of the sale and alleging that Megan may have exerted undue influence. The language was more cautious than the threats at dinner, but the effect was the same. My children were asking a legal process to examine whether I had been competent to sell my own house. David told me not to panic. "This is pressure," he said. "It does not mean they will win." I understood that intellectually. Emotionally, I felt stripped. There was something humiliating about seeing ordinary moments from my grief reframed as evidence. I had forgotten meetings after Carol died. I had slept badly. I had depended on Megan. All of that was true. None of it meant I had forgotten what a deed was. Megan's attorney estimated what prolonged litigation could cost her, and the number made her pale. That evening, she came to my house with the same proposal again. "Let me give it back," she said. "I can't watch this destroy everybody." I asked what she meant by everybody. She said Andrew was barely speaking to her. Lisa's children had stopped answering her texts, and extended family members were choosing sides. "Dad, it's a house," I answered. "Yes, and that is exactly why I won't let you surrender it." She looked confused. I explained that if the dispute were really about family, Andrew and Lisa could have sat with us and asked questions. Instead, they had researched my competence, contacted relatives, and hired a lawyer. "If I fix that by making you sacrifice what you bought," I said, "then I'm doing what I've done my whole life. Somebody creates a crisis, and I pay to make it go away." That was when I finally admitted my part out loud. "I taught them this." Megan immediately said, "No, Dad." I stopped her. "Not the lawsuit. Not the accusation. Those choices belong to them. But I taught all three of you that I would absorb consequences. I helped Andrew until business risk barely felt risky. I helped Lisa until bad financial decisions became emergencies Dad could solve. And I avoided telling you all about the house because I wanted everyone to like the outcome without having the conversation." Megan sat down. I told her about Carol's note. She smiled sadly. "Mom said something similar to me once." I asked what. "She said you were the kindest man she knew. But sometimes kindness without boundaries was just fear wearing a better coat." That sounded exactly like Carol, and it hurt enough to make me laugh. A week later, David called with the mediation date. Everyone would attend with counsel. He warned me that Andrew's attorney might push hard for a settlement that restored the property to my name or compensated Andrew and Lisa. I asked whether I should prepare a counteroffer. "Not yet," he said. "First decide what you actually want." I spent that night thinking about the question. I no longer wanted to preserve peace at any price. I did not want to punish my children either. I wanted three things: Megan's legitimate ownership protected, my own independence respected, and the truth about our family finances put on the table without turning generosity into debt. I also wanted Andrew and Lisa to understand that inheritance was not a balance sitting in an account with their names already attached. It was whatever remained after I lived my life, paid my obligations, and made my own decisions. 2 days before mediation, Lisa called again. Her voice was tense. "Andrew says the old will proves you always intended equal shares." I told her intention could change. "He says Megan knew about the will and pushed you to change the house anyway." I asked whether she had ever seen evidence of that. She admitted she had not. Then I asked a different question. "Lisa, if the house went back into my name tomorrow, what happens next?" She said, "Then everything is fair again." I pressed her. "Fair how?" She paused. "You keep living there. Later, when the time comes, it gets divided." There it was. My death, politely disguised as "when the time comes," had become the event around which they were planning. I said, "You understand that you're talking about my property as though my future is already closed?" She whispered. "That's not what I mean." I believed her, which made it sadder. The morning of mediation, I put three things into my briefcase: the closing documents, Samuel's verified financial timeline, and a photocopy of Carol's handwritten note. I did not know whether the note would ever be shown to anyone. It was not legal evidence I needed. I carried it for myself. Before leaving, I stood in the kitchen and looked around the house I had built with my own hands. For years, I thought ownership meant having your name on a deed. Now I understood there were other forms of ownership people could claim without paperwork. Ownership over your decisions, your future, your guilt, even your grief. Andrew and Lisa believed they were fighting Megan for a house. I was beginning to see that the real fight was over, whether I was still allowed to decide what happened to the life I had left. As I stepped outside, David called. "Robert, there's one more development." Andrew's attorney had sent over a proposed framework for settlement. Among other things, it suggested that the house be transferred back into my name and that future major financial decisions be made with family oversight. David said the phrase had no automatic legal force, but its inclusion revealed what Andrew wanted. I asked, "Who would provide this oversight?" David hesitated. "The draft names Andrew as the primary family contact." I stopped halfway down the front steps. Lisa had told me Andrew promised they would handle things together. Apparently, he had a different plan when speaking through lawyers. For the first time, I understood that Lisa might not merely be my opponent. She might also be another person Andrew intended to move around the board. The mediation room was colder than it needed to be. Andrew sat across from me beside his attorney, wearing the same navy suit he used for bank meetings. Lisa sat next to him, but there was space between their chairs. Megan was beside her attorney on my left. David sat at my right with a yellow legal pad and the patience of a man who understood that families could spend decades creating problems and then expect lawyers to solve them in an afternoon. The mediator began by reminding us that nothing said in the room automatically became a court ruling. Then Andrew's attorney described their position. The transfer should be reversed, the house restored to my name, and future major financial decisions subjected to what he called reasonable family oversight. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, the mediator asked me what I wanted. I said, "Before I answer that, I'd like to understand what my children believe they're entitled to." Andrew's attorney objected to the word entitled, but Andrew answered anyway. "This isn't about entitlement. It's about correcting something that never should have happened." I asked what specifically should not have happened. He said the house should never have been transferred to Megan without the rest of the family knowing. "Why?" I asked. "Because Mom and you always intended it to stay in the family." I looked at Megan. "Is she not family?" Andrew's jaw tightened. Lisa stared down at the table. Andrew shifted tactics. "You know what I mean. Equal treatment. Equal shares." I reminded him the house was not an inheritance because I was still alive. He said, "Nobody's wishing you dead." "Dad," I replied. "Then stop discussing my property as though my death is the only event left on the calendar." The mediator raised a hand before the exchange became another dinner table argument. David quietly wrote something beside me but did not intervene. The mediator asked Andrew to describe his preferred outcome in practical terms. That was where the polished language started breaking down. Andrew said Megan should transfer the property back to me. I would continue living there. My estate plan would then be updated so all 3 children would eventually receive equal value. Lisa added that if Megan insisted on keeping the house, she should compensate Andrew and Lisa for what they were losing. Megan stared at her. "What exactly are you losing?" Lisa flushed. "My share." Megan's attorney asked. "Your share of what asset that you presently own?" Lisa looked toward Andrew. He answered, "The share we were promised." David finally spoke. "A statement about future inheritance is not present ownership." Andrew snapped. "Maybe not, legally. But morally it matters." I leaned forward. "Morally? All right. Then let's talk about the entire history, not just the part that begins when Megan bought the house." David opened Samuel's financial timeline. I had insisted the numbers be verified twice before the meeting. We did not call them debts. We did not ask for repayment. David made that clear before showing anything. He explained that over more than a decade, I had provided Andrew with approximately $132,000 in unrepaid business and personal assistance. Lisa had received approximately $87,000 in support surrounding her divorce, housing costs, legal expenses, and other emergencies. Some of the money came from savings. A significant portion had been funded through borrowing secured by the house. Lisa looked at me as if I had revealed something cruel. "You told me that money was yours," she said. "It was mine," I answered. "That's the point. I chose to help you." Andrew immediately said gifts had nothing to do with the deed. "Legally, you're right," I told him. "But you're the one who brought morality into this room." Andrew's attorney tried to redirect the discussion toward my mental capacity, but the mediator allowed me to finish. I explained that when Megan purchased the house, the property did not contain some untouched $720,000 inheritance waiting to be divided. There was secured debt. There was a lifetime occupancy right affecting the structure of the transaction. There were years of financial decisions behind the balance sheet. "I am not charging either of you for the money I gave you," I said. "I'm not adding interest. I'm not rewriting birthdays and emergencies as loans because I'm angry. But if you want to talk about fairness, you do not get to erase the years when the house helped finance your lives." Lisa's eyes filled. Andrew stayed hard. "So this is punishment," he said. "No. Punishment would be demanding the money back. I'm asking you to acknowledge that generosity you already received does not create a permanent claim on everything I still have." The mediator called for a short break. Lisa followed Andrew into the hallway, but she returned alone 10 minutes later. Her face had changed. She was no longer angry at me. She was angry at him. When the session resumed, she asked Andrew, "Why does the settlement draft name you as primary family contact?" Andrew looked at his attorney before answering. "Someone has to coordinate things," Lisa said. "You told me we'd do that together." He replied that he lived closer and had more business experience. Lisa laughed once, without humor. "Megan lives closer than you." Andrew said Megan could not be trusted because she was part of the disputed transaction. Lisa turned to his attorney. "Did Andrew ever discuss being appointed to manage Dad's finances if a court thought Dad needed help?" The attorney hesitated and said confidential communications could not be disclosed casually. That was enough. Lisa looked at Andrew and whispered, "You said this was about stopping Megan." Andrew lost his temper for the first time. "It is about stopping Megan. And somebody has to make decisions if Dad keeps giving things away." The room went silent. I did not need David to explain the significance of the sentence. Andrew realized it too and tried to correct himself. "That came out wrong," I said. "No. I think it finally came out clearly." He insisted he only meant protecting family assets. I asked, "Family assets or my assets?" He rubbed his forehead. "You built all of this for us." There it was again, the assumption beneath everything. I told him I had built a life for Carol and myself, and I had shared it generously with our children. That did not turn every remaining dollar into property held in trust for them. Andrew looked almost wounded. "You always said everything would be ours someday." I nodded, and that was careless of me. I should never have spoken about the future as though I had signed it over. That admission surprised all three of my children. I told them I had avoided hard conversations for years. I had helped Andrew repeatedly because I feared watching his business fail. I had helped Lisa because I could not stand seeing her frightened during her divorce. I had hidden the house sale because I did not want to listen to accusations. I kept buying peace, I said, and every time I did, I told myself I was being a good father. Lisa wiped her eyes. Megan looked at me but said nothing. Andrew responded, "So now you're blaming us for accepting help?" I shook my head. "No. I'm blaming myself for never teaching you the difference between help and ownership." David placed Carol's photocopied note beside me, though I had not asked him to. I looked at the handwriting but kept it face down. I did not need to use my dead wife as a weapon against our children. Andrew's attorney proposed a compromise. Megan would keep the house temporarily, but an independent valuation would establish the equity, and Andrew and Lisa would receive contractual rights to portions of that equity upon my death. Megan's lawyer rejected it immediately. My client purchased the property. Your proposal asks her to buy it, and then promise portions of it to people who did not. The mediator asked whether Megan would consider any payment to her siblings for the sake of family peace. Megan looked at me before answering. Then she said, "No." Andrew smirked as though her answer proved greed. Megan continued, "Not because I don't care about them. Because every dollar I pay would confirm a story that isn't true. I didn't steal this house. I sold my condo. I used my savings. I took out a mortgage. I have legal obligations attached to this place. I will not pay my brother and sister a fee for accepting that reality." Lisa surprised me by nodding. Andrew saw it and turned toward her. "You're really going to switch sides because Dad showed you some old checks?" She stiffened. "This isn't about checks." "Then what is it?" Lisa asked him why he had never told her the proposed settlement gave him the primary role over my finances. Andrew said it was merely administrative. She asked why he had been speaking with attorneys about the old will before the dinner where he supposedly discovered the house was Megan's. That question caught me off guard. Andrew's face did not move, but his attorney leaned toward him and whispered something. Lisa continued, "You told me we needed to be ready because Megan was isolating Dad, but you already knew about the transfer. Didn't you?" Andrew refused to answer directly. The mediator reminded everyone that mediation was voluntary and advised against turning the room into an interrogation. During another break, Lisa pulled me aside. "Dad." I knew Andrew was looking into things before dinner. I didn't know how far he'd gone. I asked what she had known. She admitted Andrew had found public property records showing Megan's name associated with the house weeks earlier. He told Lisa he believed Megan had taken advantage of me and convinced her they needed evidence before confronting us. Lisa had agreed to research guardianship procedures because Andrew said it might become necessary if I was being manipulated. "I should have called you," she said. "Yes," I answered. She flinched, perhaps expecting comfort. I was not ready to give it. "You should have asked me whether I understood my own decision before researching how to take decisions away from me," she whispered. "I was scared," I said. "I believe you. Being scared doesn't make what you did harmless." When we returned, the mediation moved toward failure. Andrew refused to accept Megan's ownership without compensation or future rights. Megan refused to pay for peace. I refused to reverse the sale. Lisa no longer supported the guardianship language, but was not prepared to withdraw completely from the legal challenge. David asked for a private conference with me. "In the smaller room," he said. "If we leave without agreement, litigation continues. That could be expensive for everyone." I knew what he was really asking. Whether I wanted to offer something simply to make the problem disappear. 10 years earlier. 5 years earlier. Even 1 year earlier. I probably would have. I would have calculated how much money could purchase silence and called it compromise. I looked at David and said, "No payment for dropping a claim they should never have made." He nodded once. "Then we prepare for court." Before the session ended, I asked to make one final statement. The mediator allowed it. I told Andrew and Lisa I was not changing the house transaction. I also told them I would review my remaining estate plan. Andrew's expression hardened instantly. "So now you're threatening to cut us out?" I answered. "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." I said changing my estate plan was not punishment. Circumstances had changed. Relationships had changed. And I had learned that vague promises about inheritance had caused damage. "Whatever I decide will be deliberate, documented, and mean." Andrew stood. His attorney told him to sit down, but he remained standing. "Megan gets the house. And now she'll get everything else too?" Megan said. "Stop using me as an excuse for what you're doing." He turned on her. "You started this." I answered for her. "No. I sold my house. I started a transaction. You started a war over it." The mediation ended without agreement. In the parking lot, Lisa stood beside her car crying while Andrew walked past her without speaking. Megan wanted to go over and comfort her, but I touched her arm and said, "Not yet." Megan looked at me, as though that answer came from someone she did not recognize. Maybe it did. Lisa had spent most of her life depending on someone to soften difficult consequences. If Megan immediately rescued her emotionally, we would be repeating the same family pattern in a different currency. Lisa eventually looked toward us, wiped her face, and drove away. Andrew left first. David remained beside me under the gray afternoon sky. "You know this may get uglier before it improves," he said. I told him I knew. The strange part was that I felt calmer leaving failed mediation than I had entering it. For the first time, I had refused to purchase peace. Over the next several weeks, Andrew's side pushed forward. His attorney requested records relating to the house sale, my communications with Megan, medical information relevant to their capacity argument, and details surrounding my meetings with David. We complied where legally appropriate and challenged requests David considered excessive. Andrew produced old emails in which I had joked that the children could decide what to do with the house after Carol and I died. He also had a recording of a telephone conversation where I mistakenly referred to the sale as happening about 2 years ago, when it had been 18 months. He treated the mistake like a cracked foundation. David shrugged. People who know the date do not always calculate elapsed months precisely during casual conversation. Still, the accumulation of small things bothered me. Legal disputes could make ordinary human imperfections look sinister when placed in a binder. Andrew also found a message I had sent Megan shortly after Carol's death saying, "I don't know what I'd do without you." His attorney suggested it showed emotional dependence. Another message showed Megan reminding me to pay an insurance bill I had overlooked. There were calendar entries where she drove me to appointments. Individually, they were acts of care. In the argument Andrew was building, they became evidence that Megan controlled my daily life. For one night, I genuinely doubted myself. I sat in the study staring at the messages and wondered whether I had become more dependent than I realized. That frightened me more than losing the case. The next morning, I told David. He did not dismiss the concern. Instead, he said, "Questioning yourself is healthy. Let's separate dependence from incapacity." We reviewed the closing process again. I had negotiated. I had asked questions. I had changed terms. I had rejected one provision Megan's lender proposed. Those were my decisions. Lisa called that weekend and asked to meet alone. We sat in a coffee shop where nobody could accuse Megan of influencing the conversation. Lisa looked older than she had a month earlier. She told me she was considering instructing her attorney to withdraw from the guardianship-related claims while remaining involved in discussions about the deed. "That sounds like a lawyer's compromise," I said. She admitted it was. Then she said, "I don't think you're incompetent." I asked why she had ever allowed her name to be attached to that argument. She stared into her coffee. Because Andrew kept saying if we didn't move fast, Megan could change everything, and because I was scared there would be nothing left. I asked, "Nothing left for whom?" She looked ashamed. For me, it was the first completely honest sentence I had heard from her since the dinner. I thanked her for saying it. I did not tell her everything was forgiven. Instead, I asked what she thought inheritance meant. She said she had always assumed the house would provide security someday. Her divorce had wiped out much of what she thought she would have at this age. Tuition bills were coming. Retirement scared her. When Andrew told me Megan owned the house, I felt like the floor disappeared. I understood that fear. I also understood how dangerous it was. "Lisa, my death cannot be your retirement plan," she cried quietly. "I know that now," I said. "Knowing it and living differently are not the same thing." She nodded. Before leaving, she told me Andrew was furious with her for questioning him. "He says I'm betraying him," I answered. "Be careful. People who confuse agreement with loyalty usually call disagreement betrayal." The final blow before the hearing came from Andrew himself. Through his attorney, he rejected a proposal that would have ended the capacity dispute while preserving his right to seek limited review of the sale. He wanted the broader claims maintained. David showed me the response. In it, Andrew argued that my pattern of substantial financial gifts to my children demonstrated impaired judgment in later years. I read that sentence 3 times. The same help Andrew had accepted was now being presented as evidence that I should not be trusted to manage money. David watched my expression. "This is aggressive advocacy," he said. "Don't take every sentence as his personal voice." But I knew Andrew had authorized the position. He had taken decades of generosity and turned them around until they pointed at me like accusations. Something inside me finally settled. Not hardened. Settled. I stopped hoping the next conversation would magically bring back the son I remembered. The hearing date was set. David explained what evidence mattered. The independent appraisal. The sale documents. Testimony surrounding the closing. Medical records. Communications. And the sequence of events showing that I had planned the transaction rather than stumbled into it. Megan would testify if necessary. David might testify about my independent representation subject to the proper legal process. Samuel's records would provide context, but would not be treated as some emotional scoreboard. I asked whether Carol's handwritten note mattered. David said probably not legally. I smiled and placed it back in my folder. Then it stays with me. The night before the hearing, I walked through the house room by room. The walls held birthdays, arguments, Christmas mornings, hospital phone calls, and nearly 3 decades of a marriage. Andrew believed preserving family meant preserving his future claim to this building. I finally understood that a family could lose itself while keeping every brick. Before going to bed, I stood in the doorway between the dining room and living room, the wall Andrew had wanted to tear down. I ran my hand along the trim I had installed myself and thought about that first dinner. Back then, I believed the most shocking thing I could tell my children was that Megan owned the house. I had been wrong. The harder truth was that ownership had never been the real issue. Andrew wanted certainty. Lisa wanted security. Megan wanted peace. I wanted love without confrontation. Each of us had wrapped those desires around one piece of property until nobody could tell where the house ended and the family began. Tomorrow, we would enter a room where intentions mattered less than documents. For once, that gave me comfort. Papers did not care who was the oldest child, who cried hardest, or who told the best story. They cared who owned what, who signed what, and whether the person signing understood exactly what he was doing. The courthouse was less dramatic than television makes courthouses look. No marble staircase, no reporters, no crowd waiting for a verdict, just fluorescent lights, and scuffed tile, and people carrying folders that contained pieces of other people's lives. I sat between David and Megan's attorney while Andrew and Lisa occupied the opposite side of the room with their counsel. Lisa had already withdrawn her support for any request that would place my finances under family control. But she had not completely removed herself from the dispute over the house. Andrew looked tired rather than confident. I wondered whether he had slept. Then I reminded myself that sympathy and surrender were not the same thing. The judge was not there to decide which child loved me most. The questions were narrower: whether I understood the house transaction, whether Megan had improperly influenced me, and whether there was any legitimate basis for undoing what had been done. David began with the documents we had discussed for weeks. The appraisal came first, then the purchase agreement, the title records, Megan's financing, the settlement statement, and the deed. Nothing about them was mysterious. The dates matched. The money matched. Megan's lender had verified her funds. The closing company had documented the transfers. David emphasized that I had separate representation and had met with him without Megan present. He introduced his contemporaneous notes, showing that I understood the house would no longer pass through my estate after the sale. Those notes also recorded my insistence that I retain the legal right to remain in the property for life. Andrew's attorney tried to characterize that arrangement as evidence that Megan had gained ownership while I retained the burdens of maintaining the home. David corrected him. The maintenance responsibilities had been discussed, negotiated, and allocated. I had not accidentally signed away a house. I had structured a transaction. Then came the attacks on my memory. Andrew's lawyer used the recording where I had referred to the closing as happening about 2 years ago instead of 18 months earlier. He produced messages showing Megan reminded me of appointments and an insurance bill. He cited the period after Carol's death when I slept poorly and depended heavily on Megan for practical help. Individually, none of those facts was false. That made them harder to hear. I remembered what David had told me. Do not deny ordinary weakness just because someone is using it against you. When asked whether I had forgotten appointments, I said yes. When asked whether Megan had driven me to medical visits, I said yes. When asked whether I had been emotionally devastated by my wife's death, I said yes. Then I added, grief made me lonely. It did not make me unaware of who owned my house. Andrew looked down. My testimony about the transaction itself was straightforward. I explained why I wanted to sell. Carol's medical years had reduced our savings. The property still carried debt. I wanted predictable finances without being forced to move. Megan wanted a long-term home and had the ability to qualify for financing. The arrangement gave me liquidity and lifetime stability, while giving her ownership under terms everyone involved understood. Andrew's attorney asked whether I had previously told my children they would someday inherit the house. Yes, I said. He looked pleased until I continued. I also told Andrew when he was 16 that I'd buy him a Corvette if he got straight A's. People make statements about the future. Circumstances change. The judge almost smiled. I became serious again. I should have told my children when my plans changed. That was a family mistake. It was not evidence that I lacked capacity to change them. The financial records were introduced only to explain context, not as a demand for repayment. Samuel's verified timeline showed years of assistance to Andrew and Lisa, including the funds connected to borrowing secured by the home. Andrew's lawyer objected that gifts to children had no bearing on ownership. David agreed with the legal part of that statement, which surprised Andrew. Exactly, David said. The gifts did not create ownership rights then, and they do not create ownership rights now. That sentence captured everything. I had given Andrew approximately $132,000 in unrepaid support over the years, and Lisa approximately $87,000. I had never intended those amounts to be deducted from an inheritance. But the records destroyed the story that Megan had suddenly taken a pristine family fortune away from siblings who had received nothing. The house had already supported this family in ways none of us had honestly counted. Megan testified last among us. She described selling her condo, using her savings, obtaining financing, and insisting that I have my own lawyer. Andrew's attorney asked whether she knew I was grieving when we began discussing the sale. Of course, she said. He's my father. I was grieving too. He asked whether she spent more time with me than Andrew or Lisa. Yes. He asked whether that gave her influence. Megan paused. Being close to someone means they may listen to you. It doesn't mean you own their decisions. He asked whether she ever encouraged me to sell the house to her. Megan answered carefully. She had told me she would consider buying it after I raised the idea of changing my finances. She had also repeatedly asked whether I wanted Andrew and Lisa informed. That last fact mattered to me more than it probably mattered legally. Megan had not benefited from secrecy. She had warned me against it. The ruling did not arrive with a dramatic speech. The judge went through the evidence methodically. There was no persuasive showing that I lacked the ability to understand the nature and consequences of the transaction at the time it occurred. There was also insufficient evidence that Megan had overpowered my free will or substituted her judgment for mine. The independent legal advice, documented negotiations, appraisal, financing, and recorded deed all weighed heavily against Andrew's theory. The request to disturb Megan's ownership failed. Any remaining attempt to impose outside control over my finances had even less support, particularly after Lisa withdrew from that position, and the medical record showed no basis for treating me as incapable. I did not feel triumphant when it ended. I felt tired. Megan squeezed my hand. Andrew stared at the table. Lisa covered her mouth and cried quietly. Outside the courtroom, Andrew finally confronted me without a lawyer between us. So that's it? He asked. I said, for the house. Yes. He shook his head. You're going to act like nothing happened? I almost admired the inversion. Something happened, I said. You tried to use my grief, my age, and the help I accepted from Megan as reasons I should lose control over my decisions. Andrew said he had been protecting what our mother wanted. Your mother wanted her children to be decent to each other, I answered. She also wanted me to stop rescuing you. His face changed when I said that, and I regretted using Carol for half a second. Then I clarified. She loved you. So do E. Loving you does not require me to finance every plan you make or preserve every asset for you. Lisa approached after Andrew walked away. She did not ask me to forgive her. That helped. She simply said, I'm sorry. I waited. She continued, I was afraid about money. I let Andrew turn that fear into a story about Megan. And I let myself believe it, because that story gave me something to fight for. I asked whether she still believed Megan owed her part of the house. She shook her head. No. Then she added, I'm still hurt that you didn't tell us. That was fair. I said so. I should have told you. I was afraid of exactly this reaction, so I avoided the conversation. Avoiding it did not prevent the reaction. It made it worse. Lisa nodded. We hugged, but it was not the old automatic hug from my doorway. It was uncomfortable and real. Sometimes those are better. Andrew did not apologize. For several months, he barely spoke to any of us. The immediate financial consequence for him came from a direction that had nothing to do with court. His second restaurant continued losing money. Before the dispute, I probably would have stepped in. He had already hinted that a short-term infusion of cash could stabilize things. This time I told him I would not invest or lend. He accused me of punishing him for the lawsuit. I told him I had made the decision before the hearing. Your business has to survive without my house underneath it. He called that cruel. 6 weeks later, he sold the weaker restaurant to a local operator and used the proceeds to reduce his debt. The first restaurant remained open. His life did not collapse. It became smaller, more realistic, and more dependent on decisions he controlled. Watching that happen was harder than I expected. I had spent decades believing that if I possessed the ability to prevent my children's pain, refusing to prevent it was a kind of failure. When Andrew sold the restaurant, part of me wanted to write him a check simply so he could say he had not lost anything. Then I remembered what Samuel had shown me and what Carol had written. If I rescued Andrew again, the lawsuit would become just another crisis whose consequences I had absorbed for him. So, I did nothing. Months later, he sent me a short message saying the remaining restaurant had finally posted 3 profitable months in a row. There was no apology attached. I replied, I'm glad. Keep building from there. It was the first exchange we had managed without mentioning the house. Lisa's repair work took a different form. She apologized to Megan without asking me to arrange the conversation. Megan later told me Lisa had begun with, I believed something about you because it made my fear easier to justify. Megan did not forgive her immediately. I was glad she did not pretend. They started with coffee once every few weeks. Lisa's children eventually began answering Megan's messages again. Lisa also met with a financial planner through her employer and changed the way she was saving for retirement and helping her own children. One afternoon, she told me, I realized I was angry at you for spending money I had already counted in my head. I said, that is probably the most expensive money any family has, the money nobody owns yet. She laughed. It was the first easy laugh between us since the dinner. I met with David later that year to revise my estate plan. I told him I did not want a revenge will. Cutting Andrew and Lisa out entirely would have made the document another weapon in the same fight. Megan did not need to inherit the house because she already owned it. Instead, I established carefully managed funds intended to help my grandchildren with education and certain major needs without simply handing large, unrestricted sums to their parents. I allocated part of my remaining estate to a cancer support organization that had helped Carol during treatment. Andrew and Lisa would still receive personal items and certain portions of what remained. But I stopped trying to guarantee mathematical equality among 3 adult lives that had never unfolded equally. David asked whether I was worried they would be angry. Probably. I said, but anger is no longer the measure I use to decide whether something is right. I also wrote each child a letter explaining the plan. But I did not leave those letters hidden for them to discover after my funeral. That would have repeated the same mistake. I invited them separately and explained what I had done while I was alive to answer questions. Megan accepted it without argument. Lisa cried but said she understood. Andrew asked whether the charitable gift was money that could have gone to the family. I told him yes. He looked offended until I reminded him Carol had received counseling, transportation assistance, and home care support through that organization when we needed it most. Somebody else's family gave money that helped ours. I said, I intend to return the favor. Andrew did not like the answer, but he did not threaten a lawyer. At that point, progress did not require agreement. It required accepting that my decision existed even when he disliked it. A year after the dinner, I was still living in the same house. Megan owned it. I still had my lifetime right to remain there. We did not remodel the kitchen. We did replace the roof because Andrew had been correct about at least one thing that night. On a Saturday morning, Megan came over with a carpenter to repair the pantry door where the hinges had finally worn loose. Inside the pantry, the pencil marks were still visible from when the children were young. Andrew at 11, Lisa at 8, Megan at 4. Carol had written dates beside each line. Megan ran her finger over them and asked whether I wanted the marks preserved when the door was refinished. Absolutely, I said. Those marks belonged to the history of the house, even though the house no longer belonged to me. Later, I stood in the doorway between the dining room and living room and remembered Andrew announcing that he would remove the wall. I used to think the satisfying part of this story was telling my children who actually owned the house. It was not. The deed was only paperwork. The important thing was learning what I still owned after I signed it away. My judgment, my boundaries, my remaining years, and the right to stop treating love like an advance payment on inheritance. I still loved Andrew. I loved Lisa. I loved Megan. But love no longer meant pretending every choice was harmless or every expectation reasonable. I had spent most of my life building homes for other people and one particular house for my own family. At 73, I finally learned that a home could survive, changing ownership. A family could too. But only after everyone stopped confusing possession with love.